Power up. Welcome to Energypreneurs, where I bring to you the exciting new opportunities in solar power, battery, and electric cars. I'm your host, Sohail Hasni. I have been tracking and analyzing these technologies on LinkedIn and Twitter for more than 10 years. Now we meet on podcast.
Yeah, so how long have you been doing this podcast now?
Yeah, I just started March 2020. As I said, this is my COVID project. So I've been thinking about it for some time. I said, okay, let's do it. So I know a lot of people here and there we met, like yourself. So then I thought, okay, it is good to have a conversation with people. And then those conversations also have a market, if you like. Other people wants to find out a bit more from the horse's mouth. So, and I'm just being a facilitator here. Like you have a lot of hundreds of people read your report at IRENA every day, but to be able to hear from the person.
Yeah, the interactive format obviously gives a chance to explore some of the details, right? And so it's much more informative.
So you have been with IEA long time, and then I just quickly looked at your LinkedIn, and you also been IRENA for a long time, no?
Yes. So I started doing energy sector stuff in late 1993. So most of my first part of my career was as an energy modeler and economist. So I worked first for the New Zealand government doing energy sector modeling. I had the privilege to work a couple of years at the Department of Trade and Industry, as it then was in the United Kingdom, on secondment, working on their energy model, which was a fantastic overseas experience for me as a young man, and a real eye-opener, working at number 1 Victoria Street, next to Westminster. So it was quite an experience, and and then in, I guess, 2001, I had the opportunity to go and work on the World Energy Outlook with Fatih Birol, and I did that for 3 years, and life threw me a bit of a curveball, and I went back to New Zealand for a short time, and then back to the IEA, but working on energy technology perspectives, which was quite a groundbreaking report and a very stressful process, the first one, but we were all very excited and happy to kind of get that out. And then I've been actually with IRENA more or less from the beginning. I think I was, I'm now with my director, Dr. Dolph Gielen, I think the second longest, standing employee, at least here in Bonn.
So you have seen those transitions people read about, right? That, okay, solar panel used to be $7,700 per watt, and now it's sort of way down, less than $1, no?
Yeah, exactly. And,
or $77 a watt, $77 a watt.
For me, it's been interesting, right? Because, New Zealand, when I first started out, I mean, it's 70 to 75% at that time hydro, right? So at the very beginning of my career, I spent a lot of time worrying about how to manage, so for New Zealand, hydro is a little bit of a variable renewable because it has very extreme inflows to the catchment areas and very low relative storage. So actually, it's manageable, and the goal is to manage it, but it's actually a very narrow window that requires managing. And so it's interesting for me, through time, to see the rest of the world start to grapple with those issues that New Zealand has. And of course, they're more extreme, obviously, when you're talking about solar PV, particularly, but somewhat more predictable in many parts of the world than what we were dealing with hydro inflow. So it's been a fascinating experience for me professionally, and also to see the changes and to be surprised by it myself, right? Despite this being my bread and butter, in 2005 and 2006, I was very skeptical about, whether solar PV would really, in the end, come to the party. That every step of the way, basically, expectations have been exceeded.
Yeah. I mean, those IES hockey stick forecast, Weber published that. If you look at the chart, that says how the world's perception about solar has changed.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's taken a while, and I think most people have now got it, but it's difficult to understand when it was happening. And I think, it took a lot of people, a lot of convincing to actually understand the reality on the ground. And I think that's where I've been very lucky in that IRENA's member states had the foresight to say, look, we really need up-to-date information on what's happening about the costs and performance and the technology improvements with renewable power generation technologies, and also in the end-use sectors. I've had the wonderful experience of trying to basically push out the good news with a very evidence-based approach, right, and a very data-driven approach. At heart, I'm a data analyst. I love digging into the numbers, trying to understand their meaning and what they're telling us, what they're not telling us, and extract, if you like, what we've learned from that we can apply to the next stage of the energy transition, which I think is, obviously we're in the good position now that we can think about that, which wasn't the case, a decade ago when IRENA was initially created.
So if someone asks you, elevator pitch, what is the good news now and why it is? So what do you tell that person?
Yeah, I mean, very simply is that, the technology, particularly for solar PV and wind power, has improved so much in 10 years. At the same time that we've achieved real economies of scale in manufacturing and developer experience as well, that have all pushed down costs to the point now where in most parts of the world, renewables are the cheapest form of new electricity that you can get. And that's before considering, if you like, the fact, of course, that the competitors, fossil fuels, don't pay the full cost of their generation, obviously, with the externality. So even with that, even with one arm tied behind its back, renewable power generation is now typically the cheapest new source of electricity generation. And in many cases, it's extremely cheap. Like, there are literally dollar bills, or yen bills, or, rubles sitting on the ground ready to be picked up effectively by accelerating the deployment of solar and wind in a intelligent way. And that unlocks, obviously, not just now the decarbonisation of the electricity sector, but allows us to use electricity as a means to decarbonise the end-use sector. So a lot of the angst of 10 years ago or 15 years ago about how do we address end-use sectors is starting to be addressed as well. And we're, in the space of 5 or 6 years, we've gone from worrying about getting started on the end-use sector to thinking about how we're going to finish off that last 5, 10% of decarbonisation in certain sectors. And that's, the world has changed dramatically, actually, in even just the last 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, I even get queries from my fossil fuel country clients. I work in Central West Asia Department of ADB. I get from these countries saying, we saw a newspaper article, solar price PPA below 2 cents. Can you confirm? I said, yeah, it is there. I can connect with the people. How? And that was last year, how? And this year, that conversation has gone into, and credit to you guys, now saying, well, we read a lot of documentation. Looks like it's happening everywhere. What do we have to do so that we don't miss out? And that conversation is amazing, extraordinary, unthinkable. Just 5 years ago, 10, of course, it was unthinkable by anyone, no?
Yeah, no, I mean, to be honest, I mean, you know, I have a habit of saying, you know, today's world record pricing for solar PV is tomorrow's average. Now, that's a slight exaggeration, but it's more or less held true up to this point. But you know, for what we've focused on is actually not so much following the cheapest new price, but seeing where the averages are, and also understanding the distribution of costs and what's driving that, not only within an individual country, which is normal for renewables because you have this very site-specific element to it. Even for solar PV, you know, the distance to a grid connection can have quite a big impact. You know, you might be in the area where it may be more challenging on a planning basis, you know, so you have to invest more to ensure that you're meeting, you know, the local kind of environmental and cultural parameters that you need to meet. But to understand the differences in costs between countries, to understand who's developing best practice in certain areas and what can be learnt by others from that. And, you know, and here I'm talking about a technological and economic perspective, but of course there's a whole raft of facilitating policies or conditions that need to be met to have these very low costs, right? Around the regulatory environment, institutional frameworks, and support policies. And so all of that has to come together. And what we see is where you do that, all of that, where you look at it holistically and don't just assume that you'll be able to get a very low cost. If you work on the details, and it's not that difficult, and there are obviously benchmarks for how to do it, then you can achieve even with, so in the past, we spent a lot of time analysing how quickly new markets, say for solar PV or onshore wind, would come to like a competitive pricing level. So how much of that local learning and supply chain development was required, you know, how many years would it take? And what we've seen is that with time, that has come down quite quickly. Part of that's because we understand what's required, as you said, to have these very low competitive costs. For solar PV, it's really the modularity, the simplicity of the project development process, and this fact that we have a large number of medium and large scale project developers around the world who are hungry for new projects and new markets and are competing for it. And so you don't have to have a long-standing experience now with a particular, you know, solar or wind technology to be able to benefit from the learning that's already been achieved. And so we've seen that particularly, for instance, in Africa, where the IFC's Scaling Solar program has come in and, if you like, de-risked, you know, the project, the offtake side of it, and currency exchange. And we've seen very low pricing, very competitive pricing, almost out, you know, for the first projects at scale. And so this modularity and the competition in the market and the low barriers to entry is really driving this fact that we're seeing this, you know, much wider number of markets with very low costs for renewables.
Yeah, I mean, this morning I think I posted also on LinkedIn, I saw a news article, the new US government's target Department of Energy to have a rooftop solar price below 5 cents levelized cost, which may have happened in many parts of the world. To have it in US in 24 months, it's pretty ambitious and a very good target to have. What's your view on that? We are most likely to achieve, no, the way the prices are.
So rooftop, was that?
Yeah,
or
rooftop.
Utility scale?
No, rooftop.
I mean, wow. Rooftop is a little bit more challenging, obviously, because of the, you know, you don't have those economies of scale. But, you know, in this era of very low cost finance, that's not necessarily, you know, out of the question. But I think 5 cents per kilowatt hour is a very challenging value for the US, because they have typically had and still do, to be honest.
Okay,
a
I'm
lot
wrong.
of regulatory.
Yeah, let me correct myself. It's the 2030 target. For residential,
Okay.
5 cents, commercial 4 cents, and utility scale is 2 cents, which is almost there.
Yeah.
So US.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think it's challenging for the US for the rooftop, particularly, because they to this day, at this point in time, still have a quite poor cost structure for rooftop, and that's related to the fact that they have, at least in the past, they've had a lot of overlapping incentives, which have been quite generous, and so we've seen some value pricing. But on top of that, they've never really done a very joined up thinking around the policy and what we were talking about just a moment ago, the regulatory and institutional frameworks around rooftop solar. So, you know, permitting in the US is a nightmare. There's all sorts of issues around installation times and costs, and electrical and mechanical installation costs that mean they're just nowhere near best practice. So that, you know, for utility scale, that DOE goal is, you know, easily achievable on an unsubsidized basis by 2030. For solar PV, absolutely. But for rooftop, this is going to require a lot of work by the federal government with the states, because of course, you know, the federal government, you know, with the separation of powers and policy in the US, the states are basically the ones that are going to have to manage the policy and regulatory and institutional framework side of things. And yeah, to be honest, I mean, the US has not been particularly great at making progress on those issues so far, with the exception of some markets, of course.
Yeah, and of course, US has so many different markets within the same country. I was just wondering, what's your view on hydrogen? I was looking at this number this morning and I said, I think last time I checked that to get to hydrogen at $2.50 a kilogram or lower, you need almost half a cent to be the solar price. Now, the way if you read everywhere, hydrogen seems to be just around the corner. But if US government said we'll get 2 cents in 2030, and by the way, if you read other publications, and you need way below solar cost to make it hydrogen competitive. So how does it stack up? You have any views on hydrogen? Is IRENA doing any work?
Yeah, so I mean, in our last report on costs, we did something we haven't really done, as I said earlier, is that because of these, we've had in this last 18 months, these below 2 cents per kilowatt hour solar PV costs. We took a bit of effort to try and figure out actually, do those actually relate to what we would consider like a levelized cost of electricity over the lifetime of the project, you know, given, you know, the value, cost and value of time and money. And it was actually quite surprising to see that, for me personally, that actually there is a certain set of parameters around install costs, operations and maintenance, and the average cost, the weighted average cost of capital, that could actually deliver, you know, those kind of 1.3 cents per kilowatt hour in, say, the Saudi context, where they have fantastic solar resource, you know, a very well-developed and experienced low-cost civil engineering sector. So yeah, we were a bit surprised, actually. Well, I was a bit surprised to see that actually it stacks up potentially under, you know, everything has to line up. You have to get all your ducks in a row in terms of every contributor to cost, but it could work. And that has actually quite significant implications, obviously, potentially for the cost of hydrogen. So IRENA has been doing a lot of work in recent years on looking at the cost of hydrogen and how we can bring down the costs, and particularly for electrolyzers. And so the key thing to understand, I think, for those that are coming into this with an open mind about what role hydrogen can play, is that you have to remember that in terms of electrolyzer capacity that's being deployed, you know, we're talking annually hundreds of megawatts right? So the scale is not there. So what we see is that, you know, this is not going to be the same trajectory as solar PV, which is very different technology. But when we scale the production of electrolyzers, their costs will come down. And that's absolutely certain, you know, because we're going to go from a bespoke, essentially artisanal production process to manufacturing lines. And we're starting to see already the ambition there from some of the manufacturers to do that. So the electrolyzer costs will come down. And initially, you know, that means that electrolyzers will still be relatively expensive. So there will be an incentive to maximize the throughput. And you need very low costs to have competitive values. So what we did actually, given that we had these, we're quite surprised about the numbers lining up for Saudi Arabia, what we did is took, because they've also contracted for onshore wind, the Dumat Al Jandal project, 400 megawatts, which is around 2 cents per kilowatt hour. And again, that number actually stacks up in the context of the capital costs and WACC that could be achieved. And there's actually, Saudi Arabia, unlike most of the Middle East, actually has some areas with quite good and to excellent wind that line up with solar PV. So you could potentially co-locate low-cost solar PV in Saudi Arabia with low-cost wind. When you combine the two, you get an average yearly capacity factor that's around, you know, 50% or more. And as a result, you know, with the cost that we've seen, say, so let's broadly, you know, generalize, 1 cent for solar PV, 2 cents for wind, co-located, we could see $2 per kilo hydrogen costs if we can get kind of gigawatt scale and an all-in cost for hydrogen electrolyzers of $750 per kilowatt. So that's not today's cost, but you could easily see that happening if we get the scale coming in say 2025. I think what's interesting about the analysis we did there is that we also did a scenario, a sensitivity analysis where you drop the cost of the electrolyzer down to this value that a number of people have been targeting, and say $350 per kilowatt. And what happens then is that it's because the electrolyzer is not such. So before I talk about that, what that analysis for Saudi Arabia says is like, you really need very cheap electricity to make low-cost hydrogen. Right? So that has implications for where we might actually practically see a lot of deployment early on. Right? It's going to be more competitive in areas with excellent solar and wind resources. So that's going to be places like Spain. It's going to be places like Saudi Arabia, as we said, Australia, Chile, potentially Brazil as well. So, and parts of the United States. So the Midwest of the United States is also potentially Texas, etc. So what happens when we, you know, say by 2030, when electrolyzer costs have come down, what we see is that it becomes less important, actually, the electrolyzer contribution to overall costs, and it becomes the absolute critical thing for minimizing the cost of hydrogen is the price of electricity you pay. And it doesn't, and at that point, the economics will stack up even if you've got excellent solar only or excellent wind. So you don't need the two to have excellent low-cost solar and wind in one place. And that has huge implications actually for how, you know, how widely dispersed we can see low-cost hydrogen coming in, you know, because you don't need to have co-location of excellent solar and wind resources. So that actually changes a little bit our thinking for how hydrogen might evolve, the hydrogen market might evolve. I can see you thinking that over.
No, I'm just thinking, what about water? Because I read somewhere you need about 16 liter or something per kilowatt hour, and this must be fresh water, right? So,
yeah,
because otherwise you need to run another desalination plant, right? So does Saudi Arabia has enough water to run hydrogen plant to that scale?
Well, I mean, this is the other thing, is that overall, the water costs a relatively low contribution to the overall costs. So in Saudi Arabia, it does have a negative impact, obviously, in the overall cost that they can achieve, because they're paying much more for water. What it's more likely to do, obviously, is constrain actually the rate of growth and potential capacity, right? So there simply won't be enough water available. So that also has practical implications about where we might see the development of hydrogen. And so all of this, just, if you like, the tip of what we're trying to understand. So we've actually got a big project underway at the moment to kind of put in these numbers and actually see what might trade actually in hydrogen look like. To what extent is that going to be, what extent might it be economically feasible, for instance, for Europe to import hydrogen from Chile or Brazil or even sub-Saharan Africa? How do the actual transportation costs stack up, and how might we see trade patterns? Because obviously there's a lot of interest in understanding exactly how that might play out, and obviously there's some potential geopolitical questions that some of our member states are interested in understanding, right? How the geopolitics of the energy system will change potentially. Overall, obviously, with renewables, we're going to see much more local production, cross-border flows, certainly, but much less international trade in energy. But one area where that definitely will, or potentially will happen, is through hydrogen or other products that can be produced either from the renewable hydrogen or, again, directly from electricity. And whether it makes more sense to trade ammonia, or methanol rather than hydrogen, how does the transportation cost stack up? Because that's a little bit the Achilles heel, of course, of hydrogen, is that transportation costs are relatively high. So at least initially, we're likely to see a lot of co-located uses, basically hydrogen production at the site of use in an industrial process. But then, obviously further on in the energy transition, we're going to need larger volumes of hydrogen if we're going to really decarbonize heavy industry, if it ends up being the only economic route for, long distance freight by sea or by air. So, yeah, I mean, fascinating permutations to look at and run through the models these days.
Yeah, I have to re-look at those hydrogen numbers because, the world is divided between people who like hydrogen, people who are skeptic. I'm so far on the other side of the fence still. So I need to rethink and check those numbers. What you're giving is quite interesting. I just have to think.
Yeah. I think, I think there's the other issue here is that it's a little bit hidden when we talk about low cost hydrogen, is that it's still, even once we've pushed down the cost curve, it's still going to be relatively expensive. So it is a high cost part of the solution to the overall decarbonisation. But the key thing is here, of course, is that we're going to be using it only in areas which are very hard to decarbonise otherwise, right? So parts of heavy industry where you need high temperature heat, or where you want to avoid process emissions, which can't be addressed otherwise, actually. So if you want to think about, if you understand well the electricity system, and you know that, for 25 hours a year, the system is going to be so stressed that you're paying $5,000 a megawatt hour. We accept that because it's a small period of time over the entire year. And it doesn't have it's incredibly painful if you're exposed to spot prices at that time. But on the average cost, it doesn't have a large impact. And so, we have this, we had most of the time costs are low, and then, when system is very tight, very high cost. And if you think about decarbonizing the overall energy sector in the same way as how you manage that electricity system in 1 year, it's not the end of the world if it costs you a lot of money to decarbonize.
You are basically saying that famous McKinsey's cost abatement curve, which is it's like a very high toll on the right hand side. It's not a huge wide thing, but yes, you just do it because that's the only thing that might work there.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is that there's a lot of in many cases, there's a lot of specific angst around those high marginal abatement costs when they won't have a huge impact actually on overall product prices. So this is the other thing. So we're doing some work to actually look at what some of these abatement costs look like, and compare them actually to product prices. And of course, markets are actually incredibly flexible and capable of coping, obviously, with price changes. And I think given, we have to go beyond this angst around high cost abatement solutions when we don't really have a choice if we listen to the IPCC, and that markets are anyway today forced to deal with even wider, cost variations because of the volatility in the prices of fossil fuels or supply side dynamics in the industry, So, if the market can cope with steel prices increasing 300% in the last year or whatever it is, we can afford to add in over time some additional costs to ensure that we're in alignment with sustainable development, 500 to 700 megawatts. And we're at 6 gigawatts of cumulative installed capacity. It's in its, in terms of pushing down the experience curve, it hasn't really got started. And yet, in the UAE, we have the Dubai Electricity and Water Authority contracting at, just over 7 cents per kilowatt hour US for dispatchable electricity. So if we had the same growth in annual deployment and the fleshing out of supply chains and the competition among a wider group of project developers, I'm sure we could see costs come down, and we're already at 7 cents after 6 gigawatts. If you did that same comparison for PV, and I did at one point, but I've forgotten what the actual number is now, where PV was at 6 gigawatts of global cumulative installed capacity, the comparison is incredibly flattering for CSP. It doesn't have the same cost reduction potential as PV, but costs will come down. And my gut feeling is, 4 to 5 cents in areas with excellent capacity would be feasible. And we've done some techno-economic analysis with DLR, the German aerospace institute, to back this up, particularly again in areas with excellent solar resources. But where it really shines, obviously, is with its capacity to integrate low-cost thermal energy storage, typically using molten 2 tanks with a hot and cold molten salts. And in the report we released in June on power generation costs, we included a chart that has the adjusted PPA prices for solar PV plus battery storage. And there's essentially 2 clusters there. There's a lot of data out of Hawaii because they've been quite transparent, and they're in kind of the 8 to 12 cents per kilowatt hour for solar PV plus storage, up to around 4 hours of battery storage, which is, if you like, the economic/technical sweet spot for a battery. And then in the mainland US, in the recent results in Portugal and India, you're looking at, say, 3 to 4.5 cents per kilowatt hour for solar PV, with varying amounts of storage, from very little, so basically a token amount, probably to optimize the grid connection and provide some frequency response, through to around 4 hours. And that's 3 to, say, 4.5 cents per kilowatt. And so if you, that's on the left side of a chart, where the x-axis is, if you like, storage hours. And you put the DWA 7 cents per kilowatt hour at whatever it is, 12 to 15 hours of storage, 15 hours, I believe, far out on the right-hand side. And you look at the difference in cost. And so the cost premium actually for that additional storage is actually relatively modest. And if you tried to do 12 hours of storage with solar PV with battery costs as the hours a day, you wouldn't be able to achieve those things. So the challenge, of course, is that most parts of the world still don't need that much storage. They don't have, we actually haven't deployed enough variable renewables for there to be a very high value attached with flexibility. So we've still got, you know, say whatever it is, 40 to 60% fossil fuel generation, which means there's a lot of capacity there to provide flexibility. But, you know, at some point in the future, you know, with very high shares of variable renewables, the value of that dispatchability from CSP will become much more important. And in areas where, with high DNI, so direct normal irradiance, which you need for CSP, you also tend to have much more predictable solar resources. So CSP and PV could be, and with some wind thrown in, could be a very viable route to essentially 100% renewable electricity systems at low cost. So the real challenge for CSP is that there's not actually that many areas with very high DNI that support CSP. So it's not well, not that many. You know, there are places in Spain, obviously, US, South America, Africa, and Asia as well. But it's not a universal solution. Right? But we you know, personally, we see a very strong role for it, and potentially say 300, 400 gigawatts by 2050, if you really want to minimize costs in some of these locations.
Yeah, I mean, we just started a project working with a client in Turkmenistan to add CSP in an existing gas-fired power plant. Basically, it's an open cycle plant. They said, okay, while we are doing to CCGT, we are capturing the steam and sort of generating extra electricity. Why can't we just generate some more steam using a CSP? And it gives you a natural battery, because sometimes when those gas things trip, you don't have a backup fallback. At least, yeah, this is 500 megawatt, let's put a 50 megawatt solar. And that also helps them to toying the idea of doing some renewable, because it's 100% fossil fuel industry, or a country rather. So yeah, we are starting to look, and that's what I was looking at the CSP numbers. I said, when is going to come down a bit more?
Yeah. So yeah, it's really a question. I mean, it's really a shame, basically, that there's not more policy support for it. And you know, a few years ago, we were quite optimistic, hopefully with the 20 Chinese pilot projects, that we'd see some traction. I think, unfortunately, China was a little bit overly ambitious in the timeline that they set themselves with those 20 pilot projects, and it's caused them quite a lot of grief at the end of the day. And I think, you know, the jury's a little bit out. But if we see China really decide that, okay, this is a viable route for us, then of course, much like with solar PV, the supply chain side of things will be transformed, not overnight, but within the space of 3 to 5 years.
Yeah,
and,
yeah. I mean,
and China is already active in parts of the supply chain, which is why the costs of some of the more recent CSP plants outside of China are also a little bit more competitive.
So, I mean, thanks. We got a lot of detail on the numbers and things. I'm just thinking, the climate change, now it's in the forefront of us. And I think even the disbelievers started thinking how it is impact. When was the penny drop moment for you on climate change? When did you say, no, this is actually real? Did it happen very early piece or when? I know you have been dealing with all the solutions, but when did it actually drop, the penny drop for you?
It was probably around 2002, 2003. Mm-hmm. So up until that point, it kind of, for me, it had been important, but I was actually still optimistic, actually, that perhaps naively, I was young then, I was optimistic that despite the fact people were, the policies weren't mm-hmm. really in place to cope with what we were being told need to happen, I was optimistic that there would be the kind of momentum that came from the consensus and the years that we've been talking about, emissions and mitigation options, because of course, by 2002, 2003, we've been doing this for, seriously for say 7 or 8 years, at least in my experience. Before that, it really wasn't on the board, but say from around 1995, it was a regular discussion in the work that we did and looking at options and so on. But it was when I was working at the IEA around 2002, 2003, and of course I got more of a deeper insight into, a wider range of kind of country policies and thinking, and what did it for me was that the tone of the conversation was not right. It wasn't focusing on the benefits or the urgency of action. It was really, as so often happens, focusing on the costs and how this we can't go too fast and so on. And it occurred to me at that point that it required serious advocacy and, if you like, almost militancy to make any progress, right? And to be and to be polite but confrontational, to push back, if you like, right? So, when someone says to me, when will we be able to stop subsidizing renewables? And my response now is we'll never be able to do that if we don't correctly price the externalities of fossil fuels. Till that happens, we need to subsidize the alternatives, because that's the only way to correct the market failures that we face today. And so you have to be, I think, it's why I'm pleased about, my little role in all of this is I feel like that IRENA in particular came along at a very good time, and we've been able to, it's nice to look back in my career and say at certain points in time, we've helped push it dragged the debate forward a little bit. But yeah, for me, it was really around 2002, 2003, when I realized that the tone wasn't changing, and it really was just, let's talk a lot about options and business as usual can continue.
Yeah, I like the term.
It's been interesting.
Politely confrontational. That's a good term to use.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's the language you use is very powerful, right? And so there's a tendency in group situations, particularly in the energy sector, talk in conventional terms and to not really challenge, if you like, the world of the status quo. And I think the more you do that, the more you put, people have to justify their true position more, and that becomes slightly more awkward. And that's part of getting more consensus. That's part of raising awareness and hopefully, having that trip over into policy action.
Yes, absolutely. Now, I have another question. I mean, I personally think that the sense of urgency in climate change is not going to come down through the top-down process. We have talked too much about the problem. And because of COVID, I think we all had a bit of time to ponder and think back. Maybe people are more ready for the bottom-up action, saying, okay, no one is going to do anything. It's my problem as well. Let me get my sleeves up and do something about it. Do you see that in your colleagues or anywhere else, society in general, that people really, what's your feel? I mean, do you or do you not? What's your view on that?
Yeah, so I have an all-inclusive view on this. So basically, I believe that individual actions can help, but it's always at the margin. And given the magnitude of the change required, we have to eliminate fossil fuel emissions and probably land use change if we're having, and so that requires, systematic changes to the way we consume energy, the way we produce energy. And those systematic changes can't be driven by individuals. So it has to be, there are elements of that have to be driven top down. So I believe that you can make a difference with your consumer choices and help, push the dial, but we're only kind of bending it, and what we need is elimination eventually, and that will only come by having both the top down and the bottom up working together. And the way I like to think about it is that, if you're talking to someone, try to get them to understand that, first of all, you can do something, you can make material changes that will help at the margin, but also remember that every political issue is essentially a climate change issue. Whatever you care about, whatever is your primary concern that you want politicians to address, it will be harder because of climate change, and in many cases, much more expensive. And so, there has to be the political pressure, right, from the electorate to enact real change, ambitious change. And my other point is that, politicians then need to say, look, we can do this. We need to invest now because we've waited too long. We need to eliminate emissions at a rate faster than natural attrition. So it's going to cost us more because we didn't act. But by the time we've made the transition, it's going to be dramatically cheaper than the system that we're using today. And it's going to limit the damage of climate change.
Yes, I mean, while we, at the same time, I also think that as we talk about decarbonizing economy, we also have to decarbonizing systems. So decarbonize if you like, the people in a sense from organizations, including political organizations and other places, because a lot of people mindset change, a lot don't. So I think that's also very important, right? I use an analogy like of smoking. Just look at in my generation, how the children's perception, especially in Australia, has changed about smoking. If somebody is smoking, your 5-year-old comes saying, oh, Dad, did you see there is someone smoking out there? Why? I mean, that was not there when I was young, right? That perception.
Yeah.
Societal
And so, and if we hadn't left action so late, I would say it would come naturally, right? The younger generation, by and large, is incredibly aware of the problem and the solution. And of course, the naivety of youth means that they can demand systematic changes, right? Because that's what's needed, and they're right. So they shouldn't listen to their elders necessarily on this one, who suggest caution and timing.
Their future at stake.
Yeah, and so we're facing, it's an emergency, right? So me and my colleagues and I, we work on this all the time. Obviously, it's in the forefront of our minds, right? And this is not a problem that's in the future. It's here today. So, I'm here in Bonn. I have colleagues living over the hills here, and the floods in early July, which, devastated parts of Germany, were right here. And so I have photos of my colleagues helping another colleague empty their basement of like 12 cubic meters of mud. So, it's like I said, climate change affects all of your political priorities. You just don't necessarily see the connection. When we do, then we'll have politicians really with their feet to the fire to have action, and it will be popular. The surveys already say more action is needed. People say, if you ask them, they say, are we doing enough? They say, no, you need to do more. And most of them, if you say, does it need to be disruptive? You go the next step, they will say yes, a smaller percentage, right? But they will say that. So these are not unpopular policies, but they need to be thought through so that the costs and benefits are understood where they fall, that these are communicated, and that there's support there for the transition. So it really requires, quite a lot from politicians that may be thinking on a 3 or 5 year cycle of election. But without their feet being held to the fire by the electorate, we won't see that change. And as you say, right, with smoking, once the dam kind of bursts, it becomes the norm, right? In terms of political discourse, and action. So we need, we talk about tipping points, in the climate, right? But in many ways, to avoid tipping points in the climate, we need a tipping point in the political priorities of politicians. And that only comes from the electorate, essentially.
Setting certain norms, what is acceptable, what is not. And we are not here to compromise. It's just, this is the norm. This is the baseline, right? Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much. We can continue on and on. You are such a knowledgeable person. I'll definitely like to come back and have another chat sometime if you have the time. And I'd like to come back a little more prepared.
No, very happy to come on anytime. I love my work, actually, so I'm happy to talk about it, and I'm happy to share whatever insights I might have. I don't know everything. The energy sector is so vast. This is what I love working on it, right? Because you can never stop learning. You can't be an expert on everything, from light bulbs to molten salt and thermal energy storage. That's why I'm still working in energy after whatever it is, 25 plus years.
Thank you very much. And I hope first part was recorded despite the hiccup, because normally I have multiple backup, which I did not have today. But anyway,
okay,
appreciate your time.
Yeah, I didn't think about recording it on my phone, but fingers crossed. If not, let's do it all again.
No worries. Thank you very much. Have a nice day. Thank you.
Okay, you too.
Okay, bye.
Thank you for joining us this week. If you haven't done so yet, subscribe to our show. Also, leave your comments and review if you enjoyed today's episode. Follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter at @shasni for updates. That's SHASNIE. Once again, this has been Energypreneurs, connecting you to the innovative opportunities in solar power, batteries, and electric vehicles. Stay tuned.